new report, co-authored by the global affairs think tank ODI, examines the impact of the war in Ukraine on African economies and livelihoods. Russia and Ukraine were major suppliers of staples like wheat, fertilizers and fuel to many African countries. The war has severely disrupted these supply chains, fueling a devastating surge in food and fuel prices that has disproportionately hit the continent's most vulnerable populations. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Professor Dirk Willem ter Woude, Principal Research Fellow and Director of ODI's International Economic Development Group. The professor joins me from here in the British capital. Professor Dirk Willem ter Woude, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. A really important report, of course, but talk to me about why the ODI, as well as the partners, decided to compile it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And indeed, it's a very important report about an important topic. And my organization, ODI, is always on the lookout for policy-relevant research that can help to inspire policy and practice to improve African economies so that they can structurally transform themselves, but also that they become more resilient to shocks. And as you know, African countries have suffered from a range of shocks, including global shocks. Such as the COVID crisis, such as climate change, but also they experienced shocks such as the conflict in Russia-Ukraine. So for this particular project, we set out with partners such as the Canadian International Development Research Centre, but also a range of African think tanks, such as the African Economic Research Consortium, to explore how the Russia-Ukraine war is affecting African economies, and also what African countries can do about it, and how they can get out of the crisis in a better shape for a more prosperous, inclusive and sustainable future. So that's why we set out to do this report on this important topic.
Some of the findings in the report are quite shocking, particularly, of course, when you think a lot of African citizens, high unemployment, high cost of living, high inflation, they're not linking it with the war. Most people think it's down to bad governance, but a lot of these issues are directly because of Putin's invasion.
Well, absolutely. And it's a good and stark reminder that global events do have an impact on as many citizens across African countries. And at first look, it's maybe appearing that the impact isn't that great because perhaps the direct trade exposure from African countries to Russia and Ukraine may not be that big. But there are very specific impacts in specific countries for specific commodities that have quite some dramatic impacts. I can give some examples of the general and specific impacts. So in terms of the general impacts, if you look at what the Russia-Ukraine war may have done, we think that it has at least increased prices for food, fertilizer and energy by 10%, but probably more. But even just a modest 10% increase in these global prices will have a negative impact on African economies by about $7 billion. And as I said, I think the impact may have been much bigger. Countries will need to enhance their social safety nets, for example, because certain vulnerable groupings, also women, tend to be affected more by global crisis, but particularly this Russia-Ukraine war. So that needs to be beefed up. I think there's also work to be done on monetary policies so that these policies can be more proactive at the right time to keep inflation down and also to keep currencies without major shocks. Then in terms of the longer term policies, what is going to be really important is that you're not becoming over-reliant on just one or two sources of imports or exports, as may be the case, and that you need to diversify your economies. And now is the time to be thinking about African integration in all seriousness, and to be really thinking about the African continental free trade area, for example, to make sure that trade can flow freely across countries, including for food products, so that food security is enhanced. I think it's also important to think about domestic production as well, and appropriate domestic production when it's efficient to do so, that you don't want to be reliant only on foreign imports, but also that at home you can produce when it's efficient to do so.
Absolutely fascinating. Professor Dirk Willem Terveld, who is the Principal Research Fellow and Director of ODI's International Economic Development Group. Thank you so much for your expertise and time today.